Hi everyone. So we're going to talk today about variables, and we're going to talk about how we do output using something called the print statement. So that's our goal for this video. If you haven't already done so, I have a previous video which I'll try to link in the description showing you how to install Python idle, which is going to be what we use to actually run our programs. So first of all, when the computer needs to store something, it has to store that somewhere. And I don't know if you've seen this in another class or not, but there are really two spots the computer is going to store things in most cases. First of all is going to be temporary storage, most commonly memory, random access memory, RAM. And the second thing would be our hard drive. And what we're really talking about here today is going to be the random access memory, or RAM. So our goal is going to be, how do we use some of that for ourselves? If you'll notice, maybe some of your phones don't have enough memory to run an application. If you have an older computer, it might complain about the lack of RAM. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be stealing some of that RAM temporarily, of course, as long as we do it right. And we're going to be using that to store stuff for our programs. So that's going to be the main thing we look at today. Now, in some programming languages, there are going to be different types of variables. Python allows you to do that as well, but it's not very fussy with that. We will need to talk about that at some point in the future. There are different, what we call data types. We have things that are numeric, we have things that are character-based, and we will come back to that at a later video. But basically, the idea is that we're variable outside of computers, and one thing I learned very early on with programming is we have our own separate language for it in a lot of cases, but if we go back and just look up these words, usually there's some sort of correlation. So that word variable outside of computers means changing. You say, you know, the temperature may be variable today, so you might have a big high, big low, is what we might be saying. So variable meaning subject to change. So when we talk about a program, what we're looking to do is we're going to be able to store things. They're not going to be permanent. They can be changed. So for example, if I say enter your name, I can use a variable to store that. If I end up deciding I want to change that name, I can overwrite that value in that variable, and that's fine. So we're going to take a look at how we would, what we call declare a variable, which is just creating it. It's going to be hopefully pretty straightforward. We'll talk about some of our best practices, and although I wouldn't want you to note every single issue with how you name variables, I will definitely link to some of the rules that we have to follow when naming variables. So let's take a look. So again, I installed Python in a previous video. So what I've just done is I've just opened it up. And what we're going to need to do in order to create a new program and save that effectively is we're going to go to the File tab and say New File. And you'll see that brings up this Untitled window. And good practice is to save this. I'm just going to put this in my Downloads folder, and we'll call this Program 1. And let's go back to the example I just mentioned. Maybe I want to declare my name. So what I would do is I would say name, and that's going to be what the name of the variable is. So we're claiming a chunk of memory and we're calling it name. You can call it whatever you want. If you look around, even in the textbook we use for our textbook, sometimes they have this sloppy tendency to call things like X and Y and Z, and just makes it really hard to follow. And from my perspective, that's the way I was taught in college, and what I'd end up with is I'd be halfway through a program and I'd be like, okay, X1 and X2 and Y1, and I just kind of lose track of what the variables were. So give it a good name so you know what it is. Maybe not so important in a 5-line program, but you know, I may have mentioned I put defense systems on helicopters, and they had very strict naming standards for what you would call your variables. There were no X's and Y's anywhere. So anyway, whatever you want to call it, again, if we wanted to, we can call it Ashuvadeva, whatever that says, but I'm just going to call it name. And I'm going to say name equals, and I'm going to put my first name, Eric, in quotes. This is just, in most programming languages, it's how you represent characters. You would put them inside of double quotes to show you how you would declare a numeric variable. You see number equals 5.7. You could just do a whole number as well. And what we've now done is we've taken up two very extremely small pieces of our computer's memory, and we've now created these variables. And when we run the program, you're going to say, wow, what happened? Nothing happened because we haven't actually done anything with them. I'll show you how to run that in a minute. But effectively, what we've done is we've just grabbed a piece of memory and we've put a value in it. So what we would need to do is, if we want to actually use these variables, we would probably at this point, and this is what I'm going to start with, just do a printout. So in Python, the command that we would use to print is the word print. In an earlier video, I talked about how some languages are a little harder to read than others. If you've taken other languages, you're probably familiar with other ways of doing output. But in this case, print is going to be a pretty easy to remember name for outputting to the user. You'll also notice the stuff that shows up in yellow. This is a tooltip. The problem I have with these tooltips is they're very technical, so I would say just kind of avoid those. Now at the moment, I'm just going to say print name. I'm not going to print number. This is on purpose. And you'll see that you can go to this run menu and select run module. If you notice, I did that very quickly before. You'll see the shortcut for that is F5. So if I press that key on my keyboard, commonly, it's because I'm used to demonstrating this, and you know, after the first couple times, you kind of get used to pressing F5, I think. And at this point, what's going to happen is the computer will do three things. It's going to grab a piece of memory, and it's going to put my first name in it. It's going to grab a second piece of memory. It's going to put the number 5.7 in it. And then third, it's going to output to the screen the value of name. And we can see, as opposed to before where nothing happened, which was not very exciting, we are able to see in this point we do get output. So if I go back over, you'll see that I can print number as well. And just to show that I can do this multiple times with the same variable, I certainly can do that. And you'll see Eric 5.7, 5.7, and Eric are the values that are going to be output by this program. Now, you don't have to use print this way. You could just say print Eric, and again, notice that it shows up in quotes because that is going to be character-based. You might say to yourself, well, why should I go through all this trouble of putting stuff into one of these variables when, you know, I could just do it this way? And that's a good question. There's a few reasons for this. First of all, let's say I were to have scattered this print statement 20 times in my program, and we have a change in our requirements, and somebody says, you know, I know we said Eric before, but how about we switch it to something else? And you don't want to have to go through and manually change stuff in a bunch of spots. So if I were to say, instead of Eric, print my wife's name, all I have to do is change it in one spot, and then every spot that was previously printing Eric, when it referenced name, you'll see, if I can find my mouse pointer, that now prints that value. So if we show these two things next to one another, you'll see that the first thing that prints out is Annie, which corresponds to this line of the program. Then the number 5.7 is output twice because we have told it to print number, and the value of that is 5.7. And then again we print name, and what it does is, again, it's going back and looking what is in this piece of memory, what is in this chunk of memory, and whatever value is there is what we'll print. And then finally we do see my name shows up down bottom, and the reason is because I have manually told that to print. Now there are going to be more advanced ways for us to print. In this video I'm just going to kind of give a quick introduction to that, but formatting your output and making stuff look good for your users is going to be a very important piece of programming. In this case, I can do things like you'll see that I put the name entered was, and then I follow that by a comma, and then I type in name. And what this will do is this will take this string, this set of characters, the name entered was, and then output the value of name. And we can see that that is indeed our output over there. A couple little nuances, issues. First of all, if I make this capital N, and then I try and print it with lowercase n, it's going to give us an error. It's going to say name is not defined. So the programming language does have, most programming languages are what we call case sensitive. Uppercase, lowercase are considered different. There are reasons for that. Don't worry about it right now. So traditionally we would use lowercase letters. If we have a longer variable name, so for example we have number here, so let's say user number, and you'll see I'll change that in every spot that's referenced. We would typically capitalize each word except for the first one. This is what they call Camel Case, like a camel has, you know, humps on its back. So we do this just, again, for readability, but just make sure that the exact way that you've typed a variable name there matches what shows up down there. The other thing is, although we're not getting into mathematical operations and stuff like that today, one other thing is, now that we've entered a number, I can manipulate that number. I can add, subtract, multiply, divide, you know, get the absolute value. There's a lot of stuff we can do there. The other thing is, right now these values are considered what we call hard-coded, which means every time we run the program, they're getting the same values unless I change the code. In a future video, we're going to talk about how we get values and let the user input values. spoiler alert, it's going to be a command called input. So the user is going to be able to input values, and that way it'll change the flow of our program. Most of your programs, they require you to do something to start them off. You don't just sit there and passively run the program, hooray, run the program, run the program, run the program, because no interaction is just kind of boring. So typically these variables will come from somewhere, and we'll talk about that most commonly with an input statement in a future video. So hopefully that makes sense. Typically I would go over this in lecture, and I would have folks do this in class. Again, this is intended for an online class, but what I would say is I'll paste this in the description as well if you want to copy this and play around with it a little bit. But just be very careful. If you want it to be characters, you have to have the quotes. If you want it to be numbers, you can leave the quotes off, and don't worry about Boolean values and other stuff for the moment. So hopefully you found this useful, and we'll pick up with future videos going forward.